Welcome to the Healist Podcast, where we inspire and guide healers through business expansion. We give voice to incredibly abundant healers to share their stories. We dive into the quantum field to unlock the energies of conscious creation. We also develop digital tools to help you grow, which you can find on healist.com. I'm your host, Yuli, and I'm grateful you chose to join this space. Now let's go deep. Hello, my dear friends. I'm thrilled to have on a podcast today a very special guest, a blast from the past, a person who I've known for probably a couple of decades, who recently went through a complete life transformation. And I cannot wait for our conversation and for a catch up. So Bala was mostly an ordinary guy doing digital technology and leading startup ventures until he had an extraordinary experience the week before Christmas 2017 during a spontaneous meditation in the closet of his family's home. And everything he thought he knew vaporized that moment instantly as an expansion beyond words occurred. And since then, now he's a meditation teacher, a forest therapy facilitator, and founder of Just Love Forest, a 700-acre nature preserve near Poetry, Georgia, facilitating sustainability education and well-being experiences like forest bathing, meditation, and conscious retreats. I cannot wait for our conversation. And as you know, for every episode, I like to set intentions. And my intention for this episode to introduce you to Bala and his amazing story of transformation and hopefully inspire you, our dear healers, to follow your path and really step on this path of authenticity, transformation, and healing. So with that, I would love to introduce Bala. And if you would like to set your intention as well, please go ahead.
Hi, Yuli. Yeah, thank you. I'm so grateful that you decided to have this experience with me and allow me to come on and share some things today. I think my intention today is just to tell the truth. I don't do too many of these because oftentimes the way they're constructed, they're looking to get a certain story or a certain angle that I can no longer pretend to participate in. So for me today, it's just to tell the honest truth about parts of my transformation, and whoever and however people receive that, maybe it can be helpful. But in any case, it'll just be the truth.
I absolutely love that. And that's all we want. We want the truth. And I think to someone who kind of walks between the worlds, right? The ordinary world that many of us start in, and the world where you are now, I think you have some very unique insights that people can really benefit from. So I would love to, in your case, really, we have to hear your story a little bit more in detail before we can answer any other questions. And you did an amazing episode on your own podcast, sharing that story in a very detail. And I think it's a must listen to anyone who is going through a similar experience. So if you can give us kind of the taste of it, that will be really amazing for our listeners just to get an idea of who you are, please.
Yeah, and you and I obviously know each other from the chapter and period of our lives when we were doing digital marketing. We know each other from an agency called 360i, which was a beautiful experience in lots of different ways. And I usually, to give sort of a short version of this, I feel like most of us, and I can only speak from my own case, many of us as children are very connected to multi-layers of intuition, of sensory perception, of abilities that I still feel like we have throughout our lifetime, but they become rather dampened or latent for all sorts of reasons, mostly just the way that society is structured and we're raised, to no one's fault. And, I was one of those kids who definitely, in retrospect, felt very connected to realms of the universe that as I got into my teens, very much was dampened and repressed. And I had taken some time, went to college, spent a year teaching in Honduras, and as I came back, I originally was going to be working with third world developing nations, but the year before Google became Google, I had some friends who introduced me to a startup called 360i when it was just fledgling. And that became 13 years of my life. And I wouldn't say at that point I was living with conscious awareness and intention, in the sense that I was not asking myself the question in that point in my life, what is the purpose of having a human life and how can it best be used? It was just like many of us, I think, as we graduate college or we, are in our late teens and starting our life, I think for many of us, it does become a question of what is next and how can I support myself? And so we have kind of these visions and dreams of what's good with, lots of resource and money, and what's not so good with less resource and money. And for many of us, not all of us, our decisions become rather tainted in terms of like what is known as purpose or what is known as, the deeper work of our life. It tends to be repressed. And I was very much like that and ran into some great financial gratification early on doing exciting stuff as, search was just becoming a thing. Google was just becoming a thing. So that was 13 years of my life. And I eventually started a company, Cloud Tags, that I raised a bunch of money for, and retail technology. Again, definitely not asking deeper questions with that venture around purpose, around what is the right thing to be doing with my time, energy, and effort. It was just looking, quote unquote, strategically at all my relationships and money and time, and how can I get more freedom by selling a company and making more money. That was still the mantra, if you will, under which I was living. Anyway, needless to say, things were always, quote unquote, working out in terms of money and whatever you term as success. And then Cloud Tags didn't do that. It broke the mold. And so I got into a position where we had a certain amount of success, and then we couldn't scale, and we had venture capitalists involved. It's a classic story you hear. And so I was just raising money all the time. I was completely decimated, completely stressed. And there was a period of 2 weeks where my back sort of seized up. In retrospect, I would tell you that moment was the start of my spiritual awakening. But 3 months later, having not meditated in 10 years, you do hear these stories, and it just happens to be one of those where it was a light bulb moment. There was no slow, gradual ease into this experience. I just had a very overwhelmingly strong understanding that I should sit and meditate a week before Christmas when I was helping my parents at their house. And I had the time. And so I just literally went into this closet, shut the door. And the moment I closed my eyes, there was, as you sort of explained, Yuli, the way I term it is there was this massive expansion of energy. And in this particular lifetime, everything I would have identified with was inside of this physical casing known as my body. And that physical casing would have been identified with as my name, James Brian Yancey. And in that moment, with no psychedelics involved, no outside help, etc., I can only describe it as infinite energy. And I knew that I was that to some extent. And so that was my opening. But the key thing was, after I sat in that energy field for about an hour and finally came out of that experience, I realized as I went through that day, I didn't know it was a spiritual awakening at the time because I couldn't have articulated what a spiritual awakening was. I knew I had this experience, and it took me a couple of days of extensive reading, looking at videos and all sorts of things to feel confident that it was a spiritual awakening. But all my preferences from that point forward were erased. So that was my diet. I had been vegetarian and vegan since that moment, although I would never have aspired to be that before that moment. And that really started, I immediately realized I couldn't function the way that I had before, where I was kind of doing the dance and getting applause and getting financial rewards for telling people the things they needed or wanted to hear. And so once I realized I couldn't do business in the way that I'd done it before, and I couldn't socialize falsely in the way I'd done it before, I had to relearn everything, literally everything, which were my joys and my passions and how to use my energy and my time And it took me on a whole journey to go more into listening instead of me creating nonsense out of my mind. And so in a complete nutshell, with the time we have today, I think that's probably helpful to characterize it in that way. So it was an immediate experience that had an opening, and then it also has remained as a abiding experience. Not that I have that same intensity level all the time, but at any time from that point forward, when I close my eyes, I'm surrounded in this unconditional love that's kind of my ongoing carrying existence from that experience. So anyway, that probably helps to give a short enough nutshell just to give people a sense of how it unfolded for me. And that was 5.5 years ago.
That is an extraordinary story. And I think we hear a lot of awakening stories, but I find this to be somehow one of the most unique, I would say, this for me, because first of all, I knew you before, right? And it kind of makes it special, but also I think the level of kind of the success and the status you achieved and the level of transformation and that moment and how impactful it was for you. And I think the last piece for me is the refreshing detail in which you describe it all. It makes it very somewhat easy to comprehend to a person who maybe has not been familiar as much or doesn't have much about spirituality and those processes. I find, and especially in the episode you recorded as well, it's all very relatable. And I find it very refreshing. And I wish we hear more of those stories, because I think people need to realize that there is that possibility. And I'm not saying everyone should be seeking it. We're all on different journeys, but I definitely think kind of like normalizing those experiences, right, helps us all. But I'm curious if it was also uncomfortable and scary moment. I mean, it sounds like it was all beautiful and you're surrounded with love, but you also kind of like shedding your whole identity completely. That sounds a little bit stressful, right?
Terrifying. Yeah, I would describe the first 6 months in particular, and really the first 18 months, but in particular the first 6 months, to be incredibly terrifying and incredibly filled with joy, oftentimes simultaneously, simply because, at the age of approximately, 38, to really not know who you are, not just a midlife crisis, like, hey, I want to go buy a new car, but actually having to rediscover experientially, piece by piece, who you actually are and who you aren't, all through somatic intelligence of pain and pleasure that was incredibly intensified from what it would have been before. And yeah, I would say terrifying joy all the time.
Amazing. So talking about the process when you actually discovered Bala, building an identity. No, I'm trying not to use the marketing terms, right? Because it's really like we talked about it. It's the exact opposite. It's on building your identity and discovering your truth.
Yeah. So when I realized that this experience was as cataclysmic as it was, and it wasn't going to be a short-term thing that happened and maybe I just reverted. And there are and have been times in days where sometimes I wish I could just pretend that I didn't have this experience, or I didn't know or experience things that I've experienced. That's not pervasive at all, but there are those moments. And so when I realized that everything was going to be at some level abiding, that this was not a short-term thing and would just revert, then I had to take off an entire year. And I was closing down my startup at the time, and it was going to take a long time because we had stuff in India and Europe and the US. So we had one client left that was still paying a monthly fee because they want to use the technology. So it was not technically a year off. I still had a little bit of money coming in from that. But generally speaking, I wasn't doing any of the song and dance of what I had done before. I wasn't, pitching people in something or trying to raise money. And so the telling you of that in terms of Bala. So my spiritual name came from a spiritual teacher named Ram Dass. And some of you may have heard of Ram Dass. He was a Harvard professor from the 60s, originally named Richard Alpert, who had this whole experience of finding his guru, who was an Indian sage and saint back in the late 60s, named Neem Karoli Baba. He's a very revered saint. I mean, you can look Neem Karoli Baba up and there's thousands and thousands of stories. And so, much longer story, I took a year off because I had to relearn outside of the confines of my existing environment, because everything in my existing environment was only going to try to reinforce all of the nonsense that I had built up in my previous identity. So it was necessary for me, as I was relearning this, to get out of the day-to-day pressure, a lot of these sort of false social cues that I was surrounded with. And so I spent some time in Encinitas, where Yogananda originally founded his community in California, and spent some time in India by myself, traveling around. And eventually, much longer story, a great story, but too long for today, I did have the ability to meet Ram Dass while he was still in his body. He's left his body now, but I had some time to get to spend with him. And, the question of like a name, it's important, because one of the things that I talk to people about a lot is spiritual materialism. So a lot of times we can feel like we are evolving or transforming. So we're like letting this go. And at the same time, we're acquiring all this new stuff. And you can really just build up as much nonsense as you had before, your old way of living or your new way of living, and just call it spiritual. And like that is, America is fertile ground for spiritual materialism. And so with a name, it's almost like you're acquiring something new, like you're building something up, because I found that in my experience, everything has been about shedding and letting go. Everything's so much lighter and more open and playful. And so with the name, people will sometimes ask, they'll be like, well, why would you even want a spiritual name? Like, what does that do? And Ram Dass was asked that question before he was named Richard Alpert. And what he said was, you have your name that's given by your family, which obviously you generally have no say in. And that tends to be about, again, your lineage of your family and that kind of thing. And with a spiritual name, so like the translation of Ram Dass, Ram is the word God and Das is servant of. So it's the translation of servant of God. And so every time Ram Dass would hear somebody call his name and say Ram Dass, in his mind, he's hearing like, hey, servant of God, can you do this? Can you help me? And of course, every time you hear that, it's a reminder of like your higher purpose. And for me, it was similar. As a complete joy and honor that before he left his body, I received the name Bala Rama from Ram Dass. And that translation is Bala means strength or power. And Ram, again, means God. So it's a strength or power of God. And so when I'm on the land at Just Love Forest and someone says Bala, even when there's really hard things going on or there's multiple things going on at once, I'm constantly hearing a reminder of my work. And so when I talk about transitioning into Bala, I wouldn't even say like the being that I am is Bala, but what I would say is that transition was just like coming out. I came out when I was 18 years old as gay in high school, and it was all process. And by telling people that there's a certain aspect of you that they couldn't see and they couldn't identify with, that shatters other false stories that they held of you that were related to that former piece of that identity. So sexuality is a great example. I'm super grateful that in this incarnation, I got to do that once, because with the spirituality, it really for me has been a very similar experience. And so on the outside, you go, this experience happened. You still look at my LinkedIn profile. It was the same for a long period of time. If you saw me walking down the street, I probably looked a lot less stressed, but there was nothing that would have told you any of that. If I didn't tell you, there's nothing that would have been an outward indicator that would have told you this experience. And so also the name for me, it had to be a re-coming out process, because it's reteaching people how they can best relate to you in the most helpful way for themselves and for you. And so without me actually doing that and having a personal site finally and telling the story and using my spiritual name more often, you can't expect people to know how to best relate to you. And so it's really a choice of how far you want to embody what you feel like is the truth. And are you doing it because you're just building up your spiritual ego? Or are you doing it because you feel like this new way of existing and being is going to be of greater help to other people around you? And if it's the first, you get to work on that and use that as work to continue to shed and evolve. If it's the second, if it's truly the second in your heart, that you know that the way you can be more helpful to the world is through this expression of your existence, then it is helpful to re-educate people. And so that's kind of how Bala, this is my spiritual name from Ram Dass. And only recently, in the last year or so, have I really shared that with a broader audience.
It's a beautiful story. And I loved also the way that you talk about the re-education of people around you. And I think you've done it very thoughtfully on LinkedIn, again, to bring it up. And this is the reason we actually reconnected, because as I was going on a very similar journey in a parallel world, I had no idea. We should have probably talked more often, but I saw your post on LinkedIn and I don't go there as often as I used to. But I always say, I go there for posts like yours. I do hope more and more of my peers, kind of like my professional community, discover this kind of new world that we live in. And when I saw your post, it just made me so happy. So I immediately reached out and I thought that you did a very beautiful job kind of reintroducing yourself in a very matter of fact, but also compassionate way. And I also thought, it made me to reconnect with you right away. And I'm sure there were other connections that you didn't expect that were created because of that. But I found it also to be brave, because not many of us are willing to step out and the way you did on such a professional, network that everyone's really obsessed with their status and the identity and everything, the brand they project. And you kind of coming out with this new, not really identity, but really with your true self finally. And this is who I am. I thought it was just very profound. So thank you for doing that. And thankfully we reconnected because of that. Probably a bad question to ask, but did you strategize?
No, I don't think I strategized it. The way it works, it's a great question. And I love to talk about this because I think it's a great topic. You have all these different, so my experience is that with spiritual awakening, it's all about unification. It's all about a singular existence. And I know that before these experiences, and I knew I had it, but I probably couldn't realize to what extent. I had my social face and my social relationships, and there was a persona for that. And I had my work face, my work name, my work, relationships. And then I had my home, personal, intimate, persona. And I found that after this experience, it's just one. It's just one everywhere all the time. And the benefit of that is it frees up so much energy. And I didn't realize how much energy was getting sucked out all the time of this fabrication of nuances to who I was. And it builds up. And so it started, and it's easier to start on your social networks, right? Because, it's easier to talk to people on your Facebook universe or Instagram. And LinkedIn was the last one. I did my personal site and I put something on Facebook and I put something on Instagram. And I saved LinkedIn to the end. And I'll tell you, I saved it to the end because it was the hardest. And I honestly was most nervous about it because part of my surrender, this is how I experience surrender, is it takes a lot of courage to continue to trust in the universe and your path. And in doing that, you've got to shed and let go other things that would represent sort of shadowy shelters that you could have as your quote unquote backup plan. I can just revert to that. And so maybe if this whole spiritual thing didn't work out and I can just pretend that I didn't share the story, I'll just jump back into that other life that I hated that wasn't me, but made a lot of money. That still is part of, I think, the journey. And so I saved LinkedIn for the end because I always told myself this story that as Just Love Forest was happening, I could still get out. As long as I didn't tell everyone this story on LinkedIn, I could still revert course maybe. There was still this piece of me, not a big piece of me, but honestly a piece of me. And in doing LinkedIn, it for me symbolized my final letting go of any of the nonsense of the stories of this is a game of trading, trading cards per se. To your point, it was very much, a catharsis, kind of letting go. And it wasn't just you, there's been other people who I wouldn't have expected that have had similar experiences, but they're not talking about them in a public way, which is beautiful and fine. Everyone's journey is unfolding perfectly as it's meant to. But it did allow me to have some really honest, deep relationships with people that previously it just would have been a relationship of transactional benefit. So so I saved LinkedIn to the end and it was scary. And I did find it liberating, scary and liberating, to finally that was the final piece of the digital unification, if you will. So
No, it makes total sense and it's beautiful and good for you. I think it's the benefits of it totally outweigh. I've had the same kind of similar experience with sharing a little bit of my spiritual journey on the very first episode or the second episode actually of this podcast, and the amount of people that reach out and people completely unexpectedly, right? People from the past that getting on this journey as well, and they're looking for peers with similar experience. It's just incredible the connections you make. So it's totally worth it. So now that we talked about you finding you and going through that transformation, then how do you find your path?
What I can say is that everything I would have done previously was what I had been taught I needed to do. And so that was 5-year long planning, forecasting, getting strategic advisors, all the things, partners. And so with this, it has very much been tapping into what some would refer to as your dharma, which would just particularly mean your highest life's work in this lifetime. It's a gradient, we can get closer or further away to what is the highest potential of how we can use our time in a single lifetime to benefit ourselves and benefit, the world. And so for me, for the first time, it really stopped. It stopped in terms of me doing it. So instead of me saying, now I have these new preferences and these new drives and these new passions, so now I need to create something. Instead, for me, that stopped. And so the trust came in the stopping, and the trust came into the period of time it would take to listen, to receive. And so what I tell people now is the way I experience my life is I do my practice. So I do my practice, and that's what I do. So that's my doing. So I do my meditation, I do my breath work, I do all the things for my personal practice. So that's what I do. And then outside of that, because I'm doing that and I'm connecting in a certain way, everything else from that point forward is receiving. Every person, every situation, every moment, every quote unquote opportunity, it's now receiving. I'm not scheming. I'm not prioritizing my list of 10,000 things and blindly throwing out emails, hoping someone's going to respond to something or someone will have lunch to me, which is how I used to work. My job is to do my practice, to get as deep into my heart as I can, to surrender to the fact that there is something much greater than me doing it. And then I allow things to come to me. Different than manifestation. No offense to those who practice manifestation. I think it can be a legitimate thing, but manifestation is still usually you have an idea of something that's coming from your mind or your ego, and you're going to use practices to try to bring that to you. And this is different. I'm not projecting what I think it could or should be. I am doing my practice to become as open and receptive and clear and clean as I can be, to allow things to come through me. So instead of me doing it, instead of the story of me, and I'm going to do these things, and after I do these things, I'm going to create this other thing. Instead, I happen to be this channel of energy in this incarnation, in this body, and through me, things can happen as long as I do my practice and remain clean and remain clear. So it's more about not tainting that. And so after I had this awakening and I started.
I just want to pause here because it was so profound, and just sit on it for a moment because, first of all, it's a complete opposite of everything we've been ever taught in our business world, right? And marketing and creation and startups, right?
Everything.
And for me, because I'm going through a startup launch process right now, it's this constant internal dialogue of the old me and the new me, Oh, yeah. Do I receive or do I strategize and plan and map out and put my brain to work, right? It's just so profound. And I think it really takes, it takes practice, it takes surrender, and it's the hardest thing that I found on this journey.
Yeah. Well, I like to say to people, try doing nothing, because if you can actually really truly do nothing, a lot of things are going to happen. It's like trying to get the essence of what doing nothing actually means and what it is. And if you can get to that place of doing nothing, which is that completely clear, clean channel of just receiving, that's the doing the nothing. It doesn't mean you're sitting on your couch eating chips and, hoping for the best.
Yes. Thanks for clarifying that.
Yeah. And that is the importance of it. Like doing nothing is like one of the most sacred things you could ever possibly imagine. And once you can get truly to that nothingness, then it is the receiving. But yes, just like you, I would concur with my experience. It takes time. It's taken me year after year to let the other stuff just be quiet. It's not even that it's bad. For different people in different incarnations at different times, and the lessons that they need to use and to learn things and experience things. It's not like that's the old way and that's bad, and this is the new way and it's good. Like even that characterization of better or worse is something we can just let go of. That's not helpful. It's just how we were socialized. It's just how we were raised. It was how we were incentivized, because other people need to receive props that we know. It's important. The cult of we know, there's the cult of we know, and there's the truth of none of us know. So the cult of we know needs to have long range forecasts and needs to have lots of times to tell each other that multiple times a day. You need to rediscuss the same things over and over, because you have to reinforce the false notion of knowing, because we don't actually know. That's actually not a truth. And then you have the experience of surrender, which is, I don't know, but it's not, I don't know. It's, I don't know. It's a liberating. It's a freeing, I don't know. And so to do that, that is part of the practice. A part of the practice is to see both of those and to have enough trust. And what I love to tell people is, you don't need to believe any of this. And if you're believing anything, then that's part of the culture of we know. It's no different than doing a long range forecast. If you're deciding in your mind, if you're believing what I'm saying, that's fine. You're still doing the long range forecast. It's all the same. The believing needs to transition only to direct experience. And what I tell people is, when you're living in a world where your practice is what you do, then the output of that is only a series of tests and hypotheses, right? So your job is to live your life and experience your life in a certain way. And if you're going to try to experience it in this new way, don't believe anything. Like there's no believing involved. You just start to live your life and do practices in a certain way. And then whatever happens, happens. If you do that and actually like everything in your life continues to go poorly and wrong, those hypotheses would tell you that that is not the path of truth for you and your experience. And if you live that way and you do those practices, counter to any other nonsense that you were taught or you had in your head, just let that go. Then you get to see. So there's no believing. There's no, let me tell you that this is the way or there's a better way, because I don't know. And that's my liberty, my freedom, my sovereignty is I don't know. So I'm not here to tell you anything. I'm here to share my story. But I would tell you that the beauty is like, there's nothing to believe. So you get to either try to do this in a different way in this lifetime, or you don't. And it's not good or it's not bad. It's just optionality,
No, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And, embracing the unknown is definitely a path of choice.
Yeah, for sure. Even just doing startups, right? Take out our spiritual awakening, even just the act of walking into the unknown with a startup to create, to really build something, even if the intentions are misaligned, even if the purpose isn't of the highest vibration, that is still a spiritual process. There is still, even if it's not fully aligned, just the act of creating anything at all.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's a process.
I agree. And it's like, that's what I feel like most of my life. I've been experimenting with different forms of creation, whether it was conscious or unconscious.
Yes.
I'd like to think that I'm now at a point I'm creating my company consciously, But it doesn't mean that the unconscious result wasn't valid. It still had so many lessons that I couldn't learn any other way. But it's also exciting to discover this conscious way of building things and how different it is. And again, not to compare the two, but you also discover the ease and the flow, which is so refreshing. And for me, that was the missing piece of the startup world, right? It was all about the struggle and the hustle and all those things. And like this idea of you have to put the hours, you have to put the effort, you have to be the best, you have to compete, you have to outbid everyone. It's just like the endless of like output of energy, right? That is the complete opposite. So I think that's where it gets like the part for me that it really starts sucking you energy, right? Instead of, and when you work more consciously on creating from the soul connection, suddenly, startup life doesn't need to be hard. It could be relatively easy, right? Yes. It could just flow. And this is what I'm curious about. And I would love to hear your story of finding your path. We paused earlier because I really wanted to pause on this moment because I think it's just such an important piece of the conscious creation. But if you can just tell a little more about the forest idea and on how that came together.
Yeah. So as I was doing my practices, eventually, I had met several different types of spiritual communities. And in the beginning, when you start to get into spirituality and you don't have like your spiritual home yet, meaning like your deepest connection with how you best practice, the sea is vast. And so, it's a harrowing exploration of lots of things and, very adventurous usually. And so during that period of time, I was involved in lots of different practices and communities till I found my home and lineage with Ram Dass and Neem Karoli Baba. But as I was doing these practices, the message kept coming clear through every channel. What I've come to find is it doesn't matter if you work with entheogenic plants or if you do deep meditation or if you go deep into the breath. To me, what I found is they're all gateways to exactly the same thing around this experience of this oneness. And for me, in working with those different channels and teachers, the message kept coming back up very clear. Get a forest for healing. Get a forest for healing. Get a forest for healing. Consistently. And you must understand, you would look at my website now and look at my profile and stuff and think like, oh, yeah, well, that's what he does. But at that time, I had been involved in Boy Scouts. I was an Eagle Scout and that kind of stuff. So I had some desire to connect to nature and the outdoors. But that period of my life afterwards, it was a disconnect from nature and the outdoors. And at that time, that was so divergent from anything that I knew. So this is important because usually when you do a startup, even though you're starting something, one of the core tenets is you want to try to tie it into something you can win. Something that you can relate back to your experience. You want it to be tied to your experience and then just 1 degree of separation, something new. And this was like beyond any of that. And so even a forest, I'm like, what is a forest? What is a forest? Are we talking, is 10 acres a forest? Is 50 acres a forest? Where's a forest? How would I afford to get a forest? And then healing, like if I did have a forest, like what kind of healing would it be? And what would be my relationship to that? So all those were completely unknown. And what I would say is that the way that this has unfolded for me is that I always have clarity on exactly the next thing that can open up the surrender more truly and deeply for me. So there was no selection process. The forest was made clear to me, like here's the piece of land. I found 716 acres that happened to be contiguous forests, which is even hard to find on the East Coast. And I knew once I found the forest that it was made clear to me, having had investors and having started nonprofits and having boards and all sorts of boards and structures, if I, for me, I'm speaking for me in this lifetime, in this journey, was going to let this truly unfold, it was clear to me that I would have to sell my assets to have this completely unencumbered. No mortgage, no bank, no director, no. Doesn't mean that that's right for other people. This is my journey and how my soul's unfolding my lessons. And so there was a lot of fear in letting go of having to liquefy all my assets and sell things to have something like that free and clear. Having never been to this part of the state once, it being in a very interesting political climate in this part of the state, not something I would have gravitated toward naturally per se. Didn't know anybody who would come do whatever the healing was. So I had to just know that in getting in the forest, that the next thing would be made clear. And I could do these things in steps because everything in my spiritual journey leading up to that point was smaller tests of this leading up to bigger things. And so that is what happened. And so I got the forest, and there's so many things I didn't know about it, like miraculous blessings and stories of the land, of things that happened before we were there, with other groups of people having spiritual experiences on this land, things I only found out afterward. The whole story of Poetry, Georgia and Serpent Foot. And on our website, if you go to the About, there's like sort of the story, and there's an hour-long interview with an old native of the area who had ownership of this land before me, which I didn't know. Her name was Serpent Foot, or is Serpent Foot. Any of this was not known before I made the purchase. And so once I got the forest, again, I never owned a chainsaw. I never thought in my life I'd owned a pickup truck, like nothing, had no land management skills, never built anything. So I've never posted an ad for a single person. I've never once said, I'm looking for someone to help with this. Can I hire someone? I've never, ever, ever, ever so far in the history of 3.5 years have ever done that. It's literally been, as I got the forest, all these amazing beings have come from all over, not only just to be there and support me and support the community, but also everything I've ever needed for any kind of work or any kind of technical skill that I wouldn't know how to do. It truly, unfathomably has been step by step. People come, and when they come in, I know they've come in. Like, I just have this sense I know. They start to tell me a story of who they are and what they do. And I'm like, okay, all right, this is the person I'm going to do this with. They don't even know. They don't know. I don't know initially. And then I have to tell them, I'm like, okay, I think you're here to do this. And they're like, oh, amazing. Let's do that. The entirety of the forest has been built that way. And then the healing, I didn't know what it would be. And the second I ever heard this first person talk about forest therapy, somatically, I knew. So it wasn't a desire, oh, that sounds really cool, I think I'd like to know. It was like when someone first started talking about forest therapy, and my body wisdom, my body intelligence knew there was like this opening of like, yes, this is what you're supposed to do in the forest. So that's the overarching thing, is the forest therapy. But all the programs that we offer, all the retreats, not once have I gone out and created something in the way that I would have said I did in the past, where I just have a quote unquote cool idea, and then I'm going to go hunt the people down, and then I'm going to make it happen. Again, I'm not saying those things are bad. I'm just saying that in the evolution of how I've experienced this, not once has that happened. All the construction of all the buildings has been serendipitous. So now here I am, and it's 716 acres, and we have a series of retreats and events and things. And also in the midst of that, my own spiritual practice and path continues to unfold, and I continue to learn and deepen. And that's been a really important part of this. Is I always tell people, you can take anything. Like if I said you had unlimited money and you could do anything you wanted to, what would be the thing that you would feel is your greatest purpose? Whatever that thing is, you absolutely 100% can make that your personal hell fast, very quickly, very efficiently. If you don't continue to stay in your own heart and continue to create spaciousness in your life, to do your practice, to live life, to experience it. And so force has been very hard, physically very demanding, financially very demanding. And I would tell you that it's been my personal commitment to myself. Whenever I start to feel that lack of that spaciousness, my commitment to myself as a sacred being, like acknowledging what I truly am, is I must create that spaciousness. I must stay in the playfulness of I don't know. Because if not, it would be no difference than me sitting in an office looking at spreadsheets, counting off attendees for retreats, than if I was like building some AI nonsense on a stock market exchange. It would be exactly the same, no different, nil. And so I really just encourage people, whatever you're doing, like if you can align it with something that has a purpose or a sacredness, it's not guaranteed that you're going to live your life in that way unless you, as paramount, the thing that you're doing is your practice first, creating that spaciousness. And then almost anything could be sacred as long as, you're not doing what I just mentioned, using AI on the stock exchange, which I'm sure that could be sacred too. No offense.
Bala, this was just so inspiring. I can't even tell you. We're so fortunate to have you on this podcast. And I just love the idea of having recorded this so I can listen to it over and over, because I think there's so many wisdom. I mean, so many pearls, and for me, so many things that resonate. Absolutely. And I love the fact that you still kind of put it practice first, and the idea that the forest kind of came together the way it did. I really had goosebumps the entire time you were talking. It is so beautiful and inspiring. I think, again, we're grateful to have you, and thank you so much for sharing your truth and your story with us.
Thank you. I'm grateful. And like I said, I don't do many of these because I just have to tell the truth. So thank you for allowing me to just tell the truth.